Well, hello everyone and welcome to this session within the developer training for Sage CRM. We're looking today at using the SOAP web services. We're well on our way through the 18 lessons. We're number 13 within the series of 18 lessons that we are going to run through, and today we will be looking at the SOAP-based web services, understanding all of the resources available to us, learning more about the API and how we go about creating a project and starting to use that project. We'll look at how a session can be created, managed, as well as the usage of objects and functions for data tasks. Like many of these lessons, we can't hope to cover everything in 1 hour that we can cover in a whole day or 2 days. And like many of Sage CRM's APIs, that there is far more than we can deal with to say that this is a training session where skills are actually imparted. This is much more about an education session where I'll be pointing you in the right direction. And our first port of call really is to make sure that you know that you can always go and get the information for the API and details of its usage on help.sagecrm.com. Within help area, you need to look for the developer guide, and it's within the developer guide the API reference can be found. It itself will point to other additional resources showing snippets of how code can be written, and there will be another useful resource that you should be familiar with, which is the hints and tips blog on the community hub. So Sage City or on Sage Community Hub, Global Solutions, Sage CRM, and into the blogs. And there are at least 30 articles written about the usage of the SOAP-based web services, talking about how different tasks can be handled and how you can achieve different bits of work that you need to. There's quite a lot there in terms of example code as well, and from an example code perspective, and showing you how projects are actually written. You may also want to consider looking on the YouTube channel, the Sage Support YouTube channel, and there you can see that there are videos about the web services. But specifically for the purposes of today, I'm going to be using some code that you can download from community.sagecrm.com, and this is the test harness. This is literally a test harness that can be used for testing projects, testing assumptions about the SOAP web services, and to check functionality on different versions. And if you look inside there, you'll see a very recent version of the SOAP web services test harness. And in my refreshment of for the training material ahead of today, I've been revising and looking at the test harness and making sure that everything is okay. Once that's downloaded, it will be a full little application that can be run to teach us everything from how the logs are, how you can set up the different references that you need to, and how you would start to code. Now, all of that coding is done in the examples as C#. Any code that you see in today's session will be C# code, but it doesn't mean that you have to code in C#. You can code in any language that is happy to work with web services. And we're dealing with the SOAP format of 1.2 onwards. So that's a very, very straightforward, very easy thing to use. Here you can see where I've started up this little application, and it is a little Windows application. This is the test harness, and it's got right on the front page that it's got their whole different ways of handling data, performing tasks of finding data, insert, update and delete. And that's a useful pointing out, is that the capabilities of this API is a fully featured data handling one, where insert, update and delete are also included within the API. It's used a lot to work with different integrations. It's not as commonly used now in our integrations. We tended to have shifted over to using the REST API, but it is a fully featured data handling API, and whether you are moving data from one system to another, wanting to be able to read inside Sage CRM and perform actions against the database, then it's a perfectly acceptable API to do that. As I said, you have two options really if you are working with you're wanting to work with a web-based API to allow separate servers to be able to communicate, and in the case of Sage CRM, our two web-based APIs are the REST API and the SOAP web API, and our API is completely, in both cases, they are completely able to do any of the data tasks that we would want to do in terms of the insertion or editing of data. There are limitations with each API, and I'll discuss some of the considerations around the SOAP API as we are talking today. Very different architecture, whether we're dealing with the REST API or with the SOAP API. The REST API is very much to do with the newer Java-based architecture. Its calls go into IIS and are redirected to Tomcat in order to fetch the data or to perform the data tasks that we want. When it comes to the SOAP-based API, well, we're going straight into the EWED DLL. So it's using all of the concepts of the API that we are familiar with, or the interface that we're familiar with. So the concept of the session ID passing through security in exactly the same way. What we can think of this is as simply the raw data that is being passed as a result of the HTTP request response. And we'll start to discuss that this is not to do with the interfacing, but it is to do with the data transactions. And because it's doing with data transactions, things like the table level scripts will also fire. We'll be able to set up the conditions so that escalation rules can fire. All these, as we're performing data manipulations against the system, it then sits into an environment where it works with other calls to data inside the system. The SOAP API fits into the family of different API options that we explored right at the beginning of these 18 lessons. So here, this is very much to do with the ability to work with custom entities as well as system entities. We support that idea within the SOAP API. We can't, however, use really any features in order to generate an interface from within inside the SOAP API itself. So it doesn't have knowledge of metadata, or rather I should say it has limited understanding of metadata, but typically it understands data and data structures, but it doesn't understand things like screens and lists and actually the workflow rules and behaviors and services like mail merge, etc. So we don't have, it's really only a data transactional API. Everything else in terms of can you create an interface for Sage CRM using the SOAP-based web API that is completely devoid from metadata? Yes, of course you can. Can you work with an environment, an IDE that offers full debugging? Yes, of course you can. And I'm using Visual Studio as my development environment. There is some schema discovery. So you can, and one of the examples that I'll show you later on, actually you can do some discovery to make a request using some of the data options to be able to find out about the relationships within the system. This works on the basis of reasonable assumptions. So the specific example that I'm talking about is one which shows you how you can work out what are the foreign key references associated with a particular table. And we can then start to do other tasks within that, knowing that once we can dynamically find out what are the relationships between entities, we can start to also have a certain amount of dynamic behavior in terms of create, read, update, and delete tasks. It's completely separate from CRM's metadata structure, so it's not included in the scope of component managers. You're coding outside of CRM using the APIs to call in, but it can be used for novel behavior, including the idea of creating an application in the context of a corporate website to be able to make calls back into CRM. And that's important where a customer's site may want a completely decoupled environment that isn't relying on some sort of COM or SQL connection between a self-service corporate website and CRM. So you could use this in that sort of environment. So in terms of corporate website integration, you could use the self-service API that we've talked about. We could use REST. We can use the completely decoupled idea of sending emails or web to lead into Sage CRM, but you can also use the SOAP-based web services and the REST-based web services to design an application that will work with Sage CRM. Now, in terms of what's happening in order to use the SOAP-based web services, if you're designing using an external system, you're writing a solution inside Visual Studio, whether that's going to be ASP.NET, whether you're using Windows as I'm using, or whether you're using some other web site or development tool, then what you can do, or what you have to do, is you have to have a way of understanding what are the objects available inside CRM that can be referenced. Now, those objects are going to be the things like the company, the persons, the cases, etc. But those are also going to have to be policed by security, and we may or may not want to expose certain types of data to prying eyes. So any of the objects can also be turned off for the possibilities of web service access. That turning on or turning off of an entity for availability within the web service interface is defined within something called the web services description layer. That web services description layer has to be accessed by the development environment at least once at the beginning in order to get a snapshot of the objects and methods available to that development environment. That can be called, that can be understood as the web reference or the service reference. So the other application has to make a call in to read the WSDL of Sage CRM in order to get details of all of the object layer inside the system. Once that's read and incorporated inside the development environment, we can now use those objects to make the HTTP requests and handle the responses. That request to get hold of the WSDL, you'll see that there's a path down to where it's got the eWare DLL. Remember, everything is going through the eWare DLL here to webservice.WSDL, WSDL, and that WSDL is going to be retrieved as an XML document that is then incorporated within your development environment to be understood as a new namespace, typically within a C# environment, that to present the objects and methods that can then be used for our development and for our writing of the code. The WSDL is secured. You will find that you have to make the WSDL initially available because it's providing a snapshot of the structures of Sage CRM. You may not want this to be constantly available. You can turn it on to make it available, and if you don't turn it on, then anyone making inquiries onto the structure will see that that schema is blocked. You cannot see the structures of Sage CRM. The switching on and availability of the WSDL is controlled by a system administrator within Administration, System, Web Services, and you see there the option to make the WSDL available to all, and that can be turned on then so that you can now fetch the WSDL. It is important to remember that the WSDL is not to do with the definition of a graphical user interface. It is providing the methods by which the different data objects can then be accessed. Now, in terms of those objects as well, you will find that it is a strongly typed structure where there's a very fixed set of definitions, which is a snapshot in time for when the WSDL was obtained. When we're designing our applications, we have to take that into account because there may be drift between one system and one day and another in terms of new columns, new structures, and we will have to take into account that we may design on one system and wanting to point to a different system. The WSDL that we obtain, we enter into the project, and it becomes our web reference. That web reference then opens up the possibilities to do all of the application design. And you can see here I've created a forms application that will behind it make use of all of the objects and methods exposed within the WSDL. As we look into the code that we can see, one of the reasons that you can develop on one system and point to a different system is that the WSDL is always a snapshot for one system that you look at, but the path to where your application points is actually to a different endpoint. So the WSDL is used typically once to define the structures, but then all of the transactions go to the SOAP endpoint, where the requests and responses are then unpacked and handled to return the information that we need, or it will return a result that we can then process. We can see that our requests go into the eWare DLL, and you can see that I've amended this document, this diagram, to say it's going to eWare DLL / web services SOAP as the endpoint for any of these clients. Now, as you're working with our HTTP, can I please stress that what we need to do within the context of designing applications around or with SOAP is to make sure that you are working where Sage CRM is installed within an HTTPS environment. We have to think security, and because we are on remote systems and we're passing a large amount, or we will be passing a large amount of XML, which includes tokens for security, we have to think about the vulnerabilities of man-in-the-middle attacks. And so we need to make sure that really in a production environment, you're working with HTTPS. Well, let's have a look at these configuration fields, because this is really where we would start to think about our projects. We've got a number of different fields here that control the amount of data that can be fetched at any one moment, and the amount and maximum size that could be handled on the inbound. We can see that we can turn off web services completely at this level. So not only can we turn on the WSDL, but we can also decide whether or not our system is enabled for web services or not. The WSDL is describing objects within the system, and one of the things that we can do is to make a decision about how something like a drop-down list should be handled. Should it be handled as simple strings, or should it be handled as a potential enumerator where there are multiple options, and those multiple options of the enumerator are themselves described inside the WSDL? How do we want to handle dates and times, and do we want to have a mechanism that restricts the requests from a particular IP address? You can force CRM to only accept requests coming from a fixed IP address or range of IP addresses as well. So more details, you can see all this is described inside the documentation, so I'd refer you there. Now, let's assume that we are starting a project. What we would need to do is, within our empty project, start the process of linking that project to the web service. And you would go into, in the case of Visual Studio, you'd go into adding a service reference, looking into the advanced button for a service reference settings, and then choose to add the web reference. So you put in the path, and then that would create for us the reference that can then allow us to use the objects and methods within inside the system. They becomes the web reference that we're wanting to use. Before we even start to write the code to get to be able to test our ability to log on and log off, we have to make sure that our users are enabled. So we have this cascade or set of layers about the security associated with the SOAP web services, whether or not we're using SOAP web services as an API, whether we have decided we're going to expose the WSDL to allow an external application to see it, and then we can see that we can control exactly which users can log on. So that's done at the level of the user, and we can also control for each individual entity whether or not that is exposed for web service action as well. This would have an effect on the definition of the WSDL. So if you were to turn person web services off to web service access being no, then the WSDL will dynamically change. If it hasn't changed, then what you may need to do is do an IIS reset to force that change. There are some limited sets that we can sets of behavior that we can do associated with schema discovery inside our code. There are a couple of methods that can be used to say, well, let me understand the structure, and that's called get metadata and get all metadata, and that will get the physical descriptions for these tables and the fields that are exposed to those tables. And they're useful for us being able to double check that we're not going to be in our application trying to access a field that is not available. But let's have a look at and how the log on and log off would be handled. There are a couple of approaches in design, and both of those have to take into account the reality that what we may have to live with is that our sessions time out. They're not going to be eternal sessions, and so very often what we're having to think about is should our design be a straight in, straight out type bit of behavior where we log on, perform a task, and then immediately log off. And that will take some resources as we log on, do the work, log off. That's a single path design to do the work. That might be suitable in the case of an integration where you are wanting to push data into Sage CRM or wanting to retrieve data from Sage CRM. Another design approach can be to think about creating a session. The application, once it's logged on into Sage CRM, can sit there and wait for then the user to do the tasks that it wants to do. And in fact, the test harness is exactly that design. So you can see that and experience that essentially you log on into it using a standard user name and password, and then you can do what work you like until finally you decide to log off and destroy the session. So you've got choices on what you want to do, and as part of that choice, you have to make these considerations about the reality of what a SOAP transaction is. It's structured in the form of an XML envelope with a header, and within that, a body. So there's work involved with parsing the information contained within that structure. And that each transaction has to be checked for its conformity to the SOAP standards. Whenever we are transmitting information, the amount of information from a standard GET or POST call even within the equivalent action inside the main user interface, is going to be much larger. It's a far more verbose way of working with data. And that, because of the size of data, may have some impact. But the chief thing that we tend to traps that we fall into when working with the API is making the wrong choice when it comes to which method for retrieving data are we going to do. We can too easily ask for too much information to be brought back from the server, and that has to be thought about and understood, and there are articles that discuss this on Sage City, on the Sage Community Hub. But please be aware that we recommend that you use the SOAP web services over HTTPS because of the vulnerability of any methodology like this being exposed to man-in-the-middle attacks. But let's have a look then at our web service log on and log off. Very simple methods in order to create the session and to manage its life cycle. Here you can see that I've got some code displayed within the test harness, which shows the log on and log off behavior. That's literally handling where the username and password are accepted, passed into the method for the logon, and a result is being submitted and then sent, and the result being handled. So these are essentially all web transactions. The methods that we see are nearly all of them resulting in an HTTP request, which we then have to handle within what's called the result objects. In the case of where we have used the logon to create a session and ended up with a valid user working with our little test harness, you can see that behavior very clearly within the application. So you can have a distinction between sessions that are through the standard user interface and sessions that come in through web services. In the case of the system admin control flag, you can see here that I'm able to monitor and understand that in my case, I've got the system administrator who has been logged on through a web services client as well as through the main interface. And that doesn't show here in the sysadmin flag. It also shows inside the activity area inside CRM. So it's monitoring the creation of the session and then its destruction as well. So it's all within the activity table, and this would also be covered by locking as well. So you wouldn't run into conflicts between the session carrying out work on a table that other users would also want to be accessing at the same time. So the behavior goes through the internal CRM locking as well for rows. I mentioned that the API is verbose, and that's the case. You'll find that the logs are contained underneath program files, Sage CRM instance name logs. These are logged out if you have turned up general system logging to maximum. They have to be policed, because if you leave them on, they are going to generate a lot of XML. It's going to echo out exactly the XML that is shown. And if I was in the context of a classroom training session, perhaps a full day session, I would be encouraging you to look at the XML that is being passed, because you can see there clearly the SOAP envelope structure and understanding how each method that we use results in an an XML document that is passed, and we understand how that then, by comparison with the SQL logs, what is happening inside the database, as well as we carry out different tasks. It pays dividends to be able to spend time looking at the logs. Let's go into the process of using our little test harness and understanding how that relates to the methods and objects that are available to us. So the test harness, I'm assuming that you will go and download the test harness and make it work with your Visual Studio environment, because it provides a very simple way of seeing the structure of the code, whether we're dealing with create, read, update and delete. It's not to show you how to write a Windows application, it's to show you how a very simple application can do these different tasks. And if I look first of all at the idea of fetching data, the thing that would seemingly be very sensible and very easy is actually probably the first thing you have to get your head around. There are different methods available to use. There's query, query entity and query record. Query is when we are going to fetch a set of information that is focused on the data structures surrounding the main record. Inside our ASP API, when we said find record and we went and said found record company, it only retrieved information from the company table. Here, if I say query and I query the company endpoint within the context of the WSDL, that's a complex object which will not only retrieve the company, but the person, the phone number, the email, all of the persons for that company actually, and then all of their addresses, all of their emails, and all of their child data within the context of whatever would make up the definition of a company in a logical business sense. So not strictly speaking, only the table. It is the whole entity of the company. That means that if you were to say query and find all companies beginning with the letter A, you could end up choking on the amount of data that is sent back. Now, when we configured the screens, one of the configuring points is to say how many companies or how many main entities should be handed back. And that will then limit the amount of data returned. And because of that, we have within the query to be able to say next, 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 and fetch however many sets of data that we want. Perhaps it might be 10 companies at a time. But because we are getting with that all of the data associated with the company, all of the person, all of the phone, all of the, and for every person, all of their address details, etc. That's a lot of data being returned back. So it's very clear when we design something within the SOAP web services, we could choke on the data, and we have to be mindful of exactly what we want to fetch. We could change this. So here I can be very precise and say, I do want all of that information, but I only want it for one entity in particular. And this is where we could say, tell you what, I want now to retrieve the ID 28. And I will retrieve the company Gatecom from the demo data. And that will only retrieve back the information that is needed. So it's just handing back the information when we look at a query entity and we're looking at a particular item that based on its ID, and it returns then the company, the default the people that are associated with that company, the addresses are some associated with that company, the phone numbers and the email addresses associated with that company. But it's nowhere near as the same quantity of data. There is in fact another method that I haven't looked at here called just query ID, which allows you to say, well, I need all those, I need the IDs of all of the companies that are customers that have been in the system for less than 6 months. So you could get a listing of the query IDs and then just say, I want this one, I want this one, I want this one, to gradually work your way through. Once you've done that, rather than using the query to fetch a whole set of information that you cannot handle well and expect things to be performant. Query record is much closer to the idea of the find record method that we met within the COM ASP APIs. And this is where we are able to retrieve just the record of the entity that we want. So it's only looking at let's say the company table. It's not going to retrieve the other information that make up the larger business object. So instead of querying a very large set of information, we get back an object that is, well, it's still strongly typed, but it's much more dynamically structured, and we have to then find out what columns have been returned. So it's a generalist query, and this is probably the most valuable method inside the SOAP API, fetching data for exactly finding the information that you want and handling that. It does become a little bit more fiddly. All of these structures are working with abstract arrays concepts that you then have to interrogate and find out how they're structured. But when you come to look at the code within the test harness, that will become clearer and easier to understand what's going on. And like the query methodology that had the next method as data is limited by the amount of rows allowed, here we have the same thing with next query record, allowing us to bite more than one set of data at a time, keeping our HTML requests small and our response time down as well. Let's have a look at some other considerations though for our SOAP web services. So we have selection lists. I mentioned that we would need to make a decision about how selection lists are handled inside code, whether we are treating them as simple strings or whether we are working with them as enumerable objects that we need to interrogate. Well, the test harness has an example of how they can be handled as well, and the assumptions that it has within inside the system to be able to deal with that. Please note that the SOAP web services, when dealing with innumerable information, will translate them, but only to the base language for the system. So if you've logged on to a system that its core language is French, then the web services will be retrieving those selection items in French, and the same obviously in German, Spanish, or English. The API is a full CRUD API: create, read, update, and delete. And the test harness also provides us with examples of insertion and updating. Each of the methods that result or result in an HTTP request will also have to handle the result or the response that comes back, and where we have inserted data, then that result is going to contain the confirmation of whether the insertion was successful or not. And where we've added a new record, it would typically contain the unique identifier of the newly created record. And in the case of an update, it will contain the information to confirm this is now the data that has been confirmed and changed within inside the database. When it does come to insertion of data, it is much better, although you can use the record object to carry out insertions. When you're carrying out an insertion, especially of a company, it is much better to construct the larger complex arrays of information that you need in order to have a single transaction which will insert data into the system. But both insertions and updates don't have to take place only on one record. They can affect multiple records, so we have the possibility of working essentially with batches. So in terms of insertion, and just thinking about that, we can insert a single entity, we could insert a set of entities. We can insert a single row onto a table. Inserting notes, for example, or comments is a very simple thing that we might want to do. We can also insert a set of records very quickly. What you can't do is assume that all tables are accessible. So, for example, there are strong limitations around the insertion of data into you don't have access to metadata, for example. Neither do you have full access to the user table, because if you were bringing data across from an accounting system and you wanted to add a user into Sage CRM, you're only able to add that as a disabled user, because what you don't want to find that's happening is that if you had added those users from your external system into CRM, you would end up blowing apart potentially the license key for Sage CRM. There is a constraint in there about restricting the number of how data is inserted into the system. So I did talk about the discovery of information within inside CRM to be a little bit more. I mentioned that the query record method allows you to start to look at what's in the system. There is also a use of methods called get metadata and get all metadata across both the test harness application and another example that you can download called the Key Explorer. This shows you how you can start to derive information and understanding of an install of Sage CRM, even if you don't have metadata, but you can do some considerable amount of schema discovery by intelligently looking at the information available to you. So here, for example, this is quickly allowing us to log on to be able to identify what are the structures and what are the foreign key relationships. So here this is saying that when you look at a company, it's correctly identifying that companies are linked into cases, companies, leads, opportunities, persons, and communication link. In case of an opportunity, it's correctly linked into communications, leads, opportunities, orders, quotes, and opportunity item. These are the physical structures within the system that relationships exist. And when we are working in our development environments, then thinking about the choices that we've made and both the design of the application, but also the nature of how we're treating with this, have to be brought into mind. I mentioned that the WSDL is a snapshot in time. You only get the WSDL once, and you then have to be able to make assumptions on how the system is working. So a live Sage CRM implementation will change. So choosing the right methods to be able to find the information and insert the data is necessary, and testing the assumptions about that. That's why the metadata, the methods that I've talked about, to allow you to handle uncertainty. So query, record, get all metadata, get metadata, and then the examples that are within both inside the test harness web service example and the Key Explorer will show you exactly that. And that's through to the other considerations around dynamic information. We've come more or less to the end of our session for today. Again, I think I've presented you with far more information than you can possibly digest in one sitting. You will need to go back and have a look at the resources that I pointed you to at the beginning of the hour. You'll need to go and have a look at the blog articles, the 30+ blog articles on the Sage Hub, the Sage Community Hub. Look at those videos to revise what we've discussed, and explore as well whatever Sage CRM Ally and the information available on the Help Center can give you. But I hope this has been useful. Let's see if anyone has got any questions. In the next lesson, we'll be going on and dealing with the REST API. So please do join me then. I'll see you next week. Thank you. Goodbye.